So I'm Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of RedMonk. RedMonk is a developer-focused industry analyst firm. How many of you know what an industry analyst firm is and what we do? OK, so some of you. For those of you who don't, industry analyst firm, basically, we research, right? We look at market trends. We look at what technologies are being developed, adopted, used, how they're being used to try to determine trends. And at RedMonk, one of our primary sort of areas of focus and areas of interest, is developers. What developers are using, because we believe that this tends to be very, very predictive of where things are headed over the longer term. So as a result, sort of when we look at the market, it's not surprising that we actually have a lot to say about shadow IT, because shadow IT is largely being driven by developer populations, both independently and within sort of organizations. So when we look at this, the first question, of course, is what is shadow IT? Definitions vary and so on. But just as a sort of quick level set, how many of you know what shadow IT is? How many of you use the term? All right, so we have a handful of people. How many of you think you have shadow IT at your organization? All right, we have a bunch of hands in the back. So the basic, the story that I always like to tell about shadow IT in terms of trying to explain what it means and how it works. About 10 years ago, we were doing a report. We were doing a report on compliance trends and so on. So we went out and talked to a bunch of CIOs and executives within the securities industry, right? So the securities industry, not shockingly, is subject to a wide, this huge dizzying array of compliance regulations from SEC 17A sort of on down. And as a result, any technologies that are used within the securities industry have to comply with this sort of bewildering array of regulations. So as part of the conversations we had in the sort of production of this report, I went out and talked to a bunch of these sort of CIOs and quote-unquote IT decision makers about instant messaging technologies, right? Which at the time were sort of up and coming. AOL Instant Messenger was the most popular at the time. And we asked them a simple question. We said, all right, hey, there's this sort of instant messaging, this rise of instant messaging trend, and a lot of use in business because it's instant, because it's much sort of more efficient than traditional channels like email and so on. And as a result, this was something that we saw a lot in business and in a variety of businesses. So as I said, we talked to these CIOs, we talked to these quote-unquote decision makers, and we asked them simply, well, what is your strategy with respect to compliance and instant messaging? And to a person, every single one of them came back and gave us the same answer, which was, well, we haven't issued those technologies, so no one's using them. You chuckle, but this is the reality, right? This was, it's less so today. I think there's a greater awareness that this is going on. But the fact was, in a couple cases, 60% of the order flow at these brokers originated, initially on the instant messaging networks. Why? Because they're faster, because they're easy to use, and most importantly, because they're available, right? So this is, in terms of talking to audiences about shadow IT, trying to drive home what it is, this is one of the more salient examples, at least in our experience, which is you have employees within an organization that just want to get things done faster, they want to get things done easier, and what do? They end up, turning to technologies that are freely available to them. So in terms of the definition, our definition is quite simple. Shadow IT ultimately is IT that's not sanctioned by IT, that wasn't issued, sort of top down by IT. And these are, increasingly the way that so many different areas of business are getting done. This is what this looks like. So again, when we have sort of this conversation with different audiences, they say, OK, well, that example's fine, but instant messaging technology has been around for a while. And by the way, there's now a whole industry that basically just focuses on compliance for things like instant messaging, because guess what? They're being used. So what are sort of more recent examples? Can you talk to me sort of as somebody running an organization today, what do I need to be concerned about? What are examples of how this works? What are examples of the tools that shadow IT might be using? And these technologies on the surface may seem to have nothing whatsoever in common with each other. So Amazon Web Services obviously is one of the pioneers of cloud. Released in March and August, I believe, of 2006. It was the Elastic Compute Cloud, EC2, and Simple Storage Service, S3. This was sort of the product, or products, I should say, that effectively created the cloud market that we know today. And what this meant was it's a profound transformation. This really sort of upended traditional procurement, as we'll talk about in just a little bit. How many of you have iPhones in the room? Okay, just about the whole room. So again, this is not necessarily developer-centric. This is more user-centric. But think about how different this was. For years and years and years, if you wanted email on your phone, typically you got that issued to you by IT. Here's a BlackBerry, here's your email, and so on. But what happened? Well, Apple comes out, releases the iPhone, I think it was 2006, and overnight leapfrogged every other product on the market. Really, overnight. And all of a sudden, users are running around saying, look, you're issuing me these technologies, they're worse than what I have. They're worse than what I, as a consumer, can go out and buy in a store. So that's fine, you can keep using BlackBerry and so on, but you need to make email work with my phone. All right? So all of a sudden we have, again, this sort of bottom-up shift, where you have a real change in the way that technologies are being procured and adopted. Linux, I probably don't have to tell most of you in the room what Linux is. It's the sort of output of a Finnish graduate student. It's been around for well over 20 years now. And again, there's this sort of bottom-up adoption paradigm where you have this open source project, and it used to be for years and years and years, if I want an operating system to do anything within an organization, I would have to go to somebody and get a license. I'd have to deal with procurement, try to get sort of permission from somebody. With Linux, I didn't have to do that. Because guess what? It's open source. I can download it, run it, wherever I like without talking to anybody. This is, again, a shift towards the bottom. And, it's one of the things I think analysts and CIOs to some extent forget, which is, Linux wasn't created by people like me reporting on the technology. Linux wasn't created by CIOs. Linux was created by developers all over the world using it. And then all of a sudden, CIOs woke up one day and said, we're running a lot of Linux. We're using it for file share, we're using it for print, we're using it for web serving. So we should probably do something about that, from a commercial standpoint. We may want to get some support. And that opportunity is why we have companies like Red Hat, right? And then Gmail sort of lastly, I think Gmail was introduced in 2004. And Gmail was sort of one of the first real web interfaces that was roughly comparable to the desktop. One of the first email interfaces where it wasn't, OK, I click this link and I have to wait for the entire browser to refresh. They used technology which later became called AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript, XML, et cetera. And they delivered a fundamentally different user experience from an application within a browser context. And that's great. But from a shadow IT perspective, that actually wasn't the most important thing. Google, when they released Gmail, did something really different. They looked at it and said, OK, these storage quotas that everybody's operating under, 100 megs, this is ridiculous. The price of storage has plummeted. Why are we not giving users more storage? So what a lot of users did at the time was say, OK, look, IT, you're running Exchange, you're running Exchange off of storage prices that are at least 10 years old, and you've given me 100 megs to work with, and all of a sudden I got sent that deck from marketing that's 50 megs. That's half my inbox. So what am I supposed to do about this? So I can spend hours and hours and hours each week trying to clean out and archive my mail, making it inaccessible to me later, or I can say, the hell with it. I'm going to forward my corporate email to Gmail. All right? Anybody in the room do that? OK, we got a couple hands. I know a lot of people have. And it was enough of a problem that Microsoft actually had to go around and encourage Exchange users to up the quotas on the inbox. because this is what was happening. So when we look at these technologies sort of collectively, as I said, on the surface, they don't have a lot in common. You have a cloud platform, a consumer electronics device, an open source operating system, and a software as a service application. At the end of the day, however, their collective impact on your organization is, in the way that they enable fundamentally a shift in terms of how technologies make their way into your organization. You have developers all of a sudden that can get hardware, or an operating system for free. You have users, who are bringing, essentially their own devices, to your business. And you have applications, which are now, being delivered in the context of a browser, frequently at no cost. So again, they're all indicative of a shift. So it used to be, for many, many years, right, the typical IT structure was command and control. They're all descended from military chains of command, that were duplicated by the GM or corporate structure, for years. You had somebody at the top, a couple people under him, more people under him, and so on. It was a pyramid. Orders are issued at the top. They trickle down and are followed. So in other words, in terms of IT, what does that mean? It means that you have a couple people at the top who make decisions, and then they push those decisions out onto the rest of the organization. So they make the decisions in terms of what gets used, and sort of end of story. Now, the interesting thing is that this actually drives and influences product design in ways that are kind of subtle, right? Because if I'm a CIO, my primary concerns are things like cost, manageability, security, reliability, and so on. If I'm Apple, on the other hand, and I'm selling a phone to a user, those aren't my priorities. My priorities are, does it work? Is it easy to use? Does it look good? Right? So this shift that we're seeing in terms of a real bottom-up adoption paradigm, which is becoming more and more and more common, again, isn't just influencing the organization, it's influencing the organizations in terms of what they build, right? How do I build a product? Well, if I'm building it for a CIO, I'm going to build it one way. If I'm building it for the developers of that organization, I'm going to build it a very, very different way. And certainly this is something that the folks from Alfresco can tell you about. So, are there any CIOs in the room? Okay, we have a couple. This is, for those CIOs in the room, this is typically not a popular chart, but it increasingly reflects the reality that we see every day, right? Where you have IT decision makers, and I sort of use the decision makers loosely, of course. They have a sort of vision of what they think is being used, right? What the picture of their technical organization looks like. Then we have what developers and users, I'll throw them in the same bucket, actually want to use. And lastly, we have what is actually being used in the organization. And by and large, in an increasing number of settings, it's going to look much more like what the developers want to use, what your users want to use. Because at the end of the day, as we've seen, if these technologies are easily available, low cost, or free, not shockingly, they're going to get used, and they're going to get used in volume. So, one of the questions that we get when we go out and talk to people about shadow IT, we go out and talk to people about, hey, this is something that's going on. You need to be aware of it. One of the questions we get is, what the hell happened? How did we get here? How did everything shift? Because really, we're talking, roughly in the space of a decade, which is not a sort of great span of time, that things have completely flipped. And you see this sort of organization, the impact to organizations. A lot of the bigger technology companies are struggling. They're struggling because they're being disrupted. What are they being disrupted by? They're being disrupted by many of the trends that underpin shadow IT. So how do we get here? Now, probably near and dear to many in the Alfresco community is open source, right? Open source is profoundly, profoundly transformative. So before becoming an analyst, I was a systems integrator. I would sort of run around and do the dog and pony show with vendors. Many of you have probably been through this process, where you bring the vendors in and they do the bake-off. Sometimes they'll build you a proof of concept. And you're supposed to make a decision on that basis. Well, an interesting thing sort of happened along the way, which was you'd have one part of the organization who's involved in this quote-unquote bake-off, right? And they'd be working with vendors, and they'd be bringing vendors in to do the bake-offs and the pilots and so on, and try to compare it and try to see, well, hey, is this going to work? And sort of unbeknownst to the rest of the organization, you'd have a couple of sort of rogue elements, shadow IT elements, in the organization that would have downloaded a bunch of open source pieces. And they'd be building while everyone else was sort of trying out applications and comparing features and assembling product matrices and so on. And at the end of the day, by the time the organization was ready to make a decision, these other guys had already built the application and had it running. And they're able to do that. Why? They're able to do that because of open source software. It's not like it was back when I was an integrator, when if I wanted to do anything, I had to go talk to people and get licenses. I had to get a license for an operating system. I had to get a license for a database. I had to get a license for a server. I had to get a license for a content management system. Times have changed. That's just not the case anymore. And it's not the case thanks to open source. And the interesting thing is that open source is not a sort of static state, right? We're adding to the portfolio of open source software every year, every day. So you take something like Hadoop. Many of you have probably heard of this. Hadoop, in many cases, Hadoop is not the solution to every known problem. But Hadoop can take very, very specialized use cases around data that were basically the province of software that costs 7 figures at a minimum. And it's available for free. Now, there's lots of challenges. You have to know how to use it. You have to know how to implement it. You have to be able to sort of put it together. So not everything is free. But the underlying software, it's available at no cost. And today, as I mentioned before, when I had to go out and get all these licenses, operating system, database, et cetera, I don't have to do that anymore. Now, it doesn't mean that open source is the one that I want to choose in every case, but it's available to me if I want it. So that's great. We have open source software. And for the first time in history, developers don't need permission. They don't need to ask anybody. They don't need to refer to anybody. They can get what they need. And that's wonderful. But what else? What else would we need to sort of shift? Well, we need hardware. Right? It's all well and good to have software and to have software that I want to solve a problem, but at the end of the day, software is just software. It needs something to run on. I have to run it somewhere. And historically, that's meant, okay, I can get all this open source software, and I still need to go to procurement because I need to give them a machine. And 9 times out of 10, they're going to come back and say, well, yeah, we can get you a server, but we need to image it. We need to test the box. We need to rack and stack it. And so we're talking weeks, or some cases months. I had lunch with a friend of mine who works at a very, very large healthcare company, and he was telling me, he was on a 6-month project. Right? He's in the architect sysadmin side. He's on the 6-month project to streamline and slim their provisioning time for servers. So 6 months later, he's like, no, we've got it. And I was like, okay, that's great. I'm really happy for you, 6 months. I was like, well, what's your provisioning time now? He's like, we can usually, not always, but we can usually deliver same day. It's down from weeks. I said, that's great, but you may want another 6-month project because that's not the expectation anymore. As we've talked about, as of 2006, Amazon Web Services fundamentally and irrevocably changed the paradigm around software. So it's no longer, are people going to be content to wait weeks or even a day? Now the expectation is I want a server in about 60 or 90 seconds. And by the way, I don't want to pay for it up front. So we've seen the disruption that this change has had on businesses, right? Dell went private for a reason, right? One of those reasons is Amazon. Because all of a sudden, I don't have to pay for everything up front. As another friend of mine says, this quote actually is about 2 years old, so the economics are even more favorable now than they were at the time. But basically, EC2 means that anyone with a $10 bill can rent a 10-machine cluster with a terabyte of distributed storage for 8 hours. Think about that. I mean, that's insane. Again, when I was a systems integrator, I was lucky to get a crappy Pentium box in weeks, for thousands of dollars. Now, I can get a huge cluster. And I can pay something that's going to sort of slip by, expense reports. I had another lunch with the developers from a large news organization. And like many large news organizations, it's struggling. And they were kind of, these developers were joking, right? They were looking at this saying, well, there's an IT freeze, so I can't get anything approved. I can't buy anything. I can't buy storage. I can't buy gear. I can't buy software. I can buy nothing. And yet, it's not as if people have told me, OK, we know that you don't have any tools anymore, so we're not going to ask you to do anything new. So, well, they're like, well, people are still piling things on my plate, but I don't have anywhere to put it. So they looked around, and I thought this was pretty creative. They looked around and saw that as a news organization, one of the things that was still being approved on expense reports was books, right? Because reporters need to do research. They need their sort of materials. So they sat back and said, I wonder if we were to try to buy our infrastructure and pass it off as books, what would happen? And sure enough, because they're purchasing it sort of incrementally and because they're not trying to pass through any $3,000 or $4,000 charges, because it comes through sort of in pieces, it made it through procurement. It made it through their expense reports. So they sort of jokingly referred to it as infrastructure that they bought as books. And that is the new reality. So in other words, it's great we have all that free software. Now, within organizations, you now have the ability to essentially get hardware at a cost that's affordable on an individual basis, that an individual can submit an expense report for. Now, there are difficulties, of course. I talked to a CIO from an organization who has a developer on his team who submitted a $40,000 bill to be expensed from Amazon. And actually, the guy paid it, because he's like, you know what? It's actually probably cheaper than I get from my IT. So the costs do add up. But the point is that on an individual basis within your companies, or for those of you in the room who are developers, you know this, everything has become accessible. Everything is available to you. So that's great. You have hardware and software. Fantastic. But what might we be able to do if we had access to sort of applications? What's different? How about education and training? Have any of you heard of MOOCs? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, we have a handful. So a MOOC is it's an acronym that refers to massively open online courses. So these are courses where you have institutions like Coursera, Khan Academy, which are independent. You have institutions like Stanford or edX, which is a collaboration between MIT and Harvard. So you have long-standing institutions who are invested in this. You have startups which are invested in this. And what are they invested in? They're invested in making high-quality educational resources available at free, for free or at very low cost in some cases. And the interest has been huge, right? So at Stanford, one of the courses, I believe is their machine learning course, had over 160,000 students enrolled one semester. 160,000. So one of the criticisms of MOOCs, of course, is that the completion rates are lower, right? Not surprisingly, if you only sign up and you're taking a course in a browser, you're probably less motivated to complete it than you would be if you have to physically go to class and if you physically paid for it. But the flip side of that is that you don't need your completion rates to be very high if your enrollment's at 160,000 for one class for one semester. So the point here is that when we think about the individuals within your organization, or indeed yourselves, we have free software available, which is great. We have low-cost hardware, which is available, also great. You also have a wealth of training and educational resources that are available to you and will transform either yourselves or your employees and give them sort of new abilities that they never had before. Because frankly, any of you who have been in an organization and tried to convince somebody that you needed training, it's not a pleasant process typically. I, at one point, had to convince my boss not only that I need training to complete a project, but that training wouldn't make me so valuable that I would then be poached by somewhere else. And that's those are the hoops that people used to have to jump through. You don't have to do that anymore. All right? The educational resources available to you online and to your employees are really becoming incredible in terms of the breadth that they offer, in terms of the potential that they'll unlock. So that's great. We can educate ourselves. But what about working together? How many of you in the room use GitHub? Anybody? Oh, we actually have a good number of people. So many of you are probably familiar with the basic idea, right? So in other words, we've had things like Apache and Eclipse, and indeed, sort of open source projects around for a long time. So the basic paradigm in terms of, okay, well, we work on these resources collectively, and so that's pretty well understood. The interesting thing is that GitHub is increasingly becoming a massive center of gravity, and a focus not just for projects, right? Not just for the work that we do sort of on projects with one another, but it's become sort of a resource for just sharing one-off scripts, right? So I work as an analyst. I do a lot of my analytics work in a statistical language called R, right? And going back on sort of the education theme, I get a lot of education from Stack Overflow. Better support, frankly, than I get from a commercial vendor. I'll ask very, very weird, esoteric questions in terms of formatting a chart, and it's the rare day when I don't get an answer back in 20 minutes. That's how good the educational resources are. Even better, though, is that sometimes I don't even have to ask because the collaboration is so good. I could go to GitHub, and there are scripts for pretty much anything I want to do, right? Because we have a whole generation of developers that is growing up, is collaborating with each other, and sharing sort of the fruits of their work, such that I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I don't have to come up with a new way to do this. In other words, if I want to do sentiment analysis on a Twitter stack, I guarantee you right now there are probably 10 or 20 options on how to do that in R on GitHub right now. That's the kind of collaboration that is enabled through these properties, and it is hugely transformative. Because as we said, you begin to add all these pieces up, right? You have the free software, you have the free hardware, you have the ability to educate yourself with these courses. And by the way, now, half the things that you want to do, somebody's already done, and the script's out there on GitHub. Hugely transformative. And then lastly, from a SaaS standpoint, one of the things that we've talked to developers about forever is, like, they're more valuable every day than they were the day before. So why don't sort of more of them market that? Why don't more of them take advantage of that opportunity? Why don't more of them freelance, if you will? If you're really good and you have great Alfresco skills, why not sort of take your show on the road? And a lot of them will say, well, I don't know, I don't like the sales aspect. I don't like to sell myself. I don't like to sell my services. Good news, you don't have to. There are now properties that will do that for you. You can market your services. You can market yourself as a consultant through properties, Elan, Sodesk, et cetera. Or maybe you have an idea for a great mobile app that connects in and does interesting things with Alfresco. Guess what? You can build it, sell it through marketplaces like the Play Marketplace for Android, the Apple App Store. You have effectively an unlimited opportunity to monetize yourself with none of the traditional overhead of trying to sort of sell and market your business, because your properties, these digital properties will do that for you. So that's great. We have all those different pieces. We're all more empowered. But at the end of the day, whether we're talking about sort of employees within an organization, whether we're talking about developers freelancing and so on, there's a need for capital, right? I mean, where am I going to find the money to do the things that I want to do? What if I want to start a business around Alfresco, expand the ecosystem? Well, even if I have free hardware, software, training, et cetera, I have a mortgage to pay. I need to eat. And this is one of the sort of more interesting things that's happened. So this is based on research done by a gentleman by the name of Chris Tacey. And what he did is sort of look at the number of venture deals, the number of sort of venture capital funded essentially engagements. And then compared and contrasted that versus the total size of those deals. So you can see for most of the chart, there's a pretty tight correlation. They're a little off, but in terms of directionally, you're basically looking at the same thing. So the deal size more or less tracks the deal volume. And then in the middle, anybody want to guess at what the split is? Why they forked? That's exactly right. That's one opportunity. There's another that I'll get to. So Amazon was the suggestion. So if you note, the split roughly occurs around 2006. So in other words, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, which is, hey, all of a sudden, I can start a business and I don't have to pay for all this hardware up front. I don't have to go out and buy tens of thousands of dollars of servers. I can pay $50, $100, a couple $100 a month, whatever. So if I'm then a venture company, I'm going to be looking at starting a business, well, it's going to cost me less. So I can fund more deals with less money because it fundamentally takes less money to start a company than it did. And interestingly, around the same time, we saw the emergence of new investment vehicles. All right, so you have seed stage. Anybody heard of Y Combinator? Anybody? We have a couple hands in the room. So Y Combinator, sort of a new breed of VCs, if you will. And what they do is they give you a lot less money, but they take a lot less of your company in return. And they do this because, as we've talked about, it just costs less. It costs less to run a company today. It costs less to run your technology today because you have such a wealth of resources available either for free or at no cost. So from an organizational standpoint, what does this mean? Well, it means that procurement has changed and it's not changing back. All right, this change is very likely permanent because all of a sudden, again, I don't need to talk to anybody if I need software. I don't need to talk to somebody if I need hardware necessarily. I don't need to talk to somebody for training. So procurement's going to have to change. The way that we do procurement will fundamentally have to shift in light of the availability, accessibility, and lack of cost of many of these resources. So a lot of times, we'll sort of run through this spiel, and everyone will say, well, it kind of makes sense, but I'm still skeptical. I'm not buying this. I'm not buying the idea that developers are as powerful as you say there. I'm not buying the idea that shadow IT has the necessary clout to really shift the way that I'm operating within my organization. So we run through a couple of different sort of examples or data points for them. So programming language adoption is one. As I said at the outset, sort of as an industry analyst firm, we track trends. We track what developers specifically are using, what they want to use, why they're using it, and so on. And one of the things that we track pretty closely is programming language adoption, if I can say that. OK, so this is an eye chart. You're not meant to read it. The idea here, rather, is that what we do is we track communities, and we track what those communities are using. And two communities that we spend a lot of time looking at are GitHub and Stack Overflow. So one axis to this graph is GitHub. The other axis is Stack Overflow. And what we do is we look at the relative popularity of programming languages in these communities. And we just compare and contrast them. And there's a couple interesting conclusions. Actually, there's a number of interesting conclusions to be drawn from this. But for our purposes today, the interesting thing is that you have two clusters. Right? You can see at the top right-hand, absolute top right-hand corner, you have sort of one cluster. And then you can kind of make out a second cluster on the way down. And then the tier 3 and tier 4 are much less distinct. Now, the important thing here, and probably for many of you in the room have lived this in much the same way that I did, was that for years and years and years, if you're going to do anything within an organization, you're going to do it with either Java or something from the .NET stack, right? ASP, C#, Visual Basic, what have you. Because those were the sanctioned languages. That's what IT would let you use. Now, as we've been talking about, there's all sorts of things I can do now without talking to IT, without asking IT for permission. And not surprisingly, when developers begin to make choices, when you have more people making more choices, they select more things. So when we go out and actually look at the traction, and on GitHub, this is in terms of actual projects, this is actual code. And on Stack Overflow side, this is questions that are asked about that code. What we find is that there are a lot of languages being used. So the top tier languages, the tier 1, the upper right-hand corner, are a lot of the usual suspects. So Java, most obviously. You have C# from the Microsoft side. You have Ruby, Python, Perl, all these sort of languages that you hear a lot about. The interesting thing is that, so there's, I don't know, depending on when we run it, anywhere from 12 to 14 languages in tier 1 that are used enough that they sort of cluster as popular. The interesting thing is that if you go down to the second tier, which is a much bigger segment, probably 30 or 40, or actually in this one, probably 25 languages in there. These are actually popular languages. These are things like Scala, Clojure, R, which I use. Go, which is an emerging language that was originally created by Google. These are popular, and yet these are second tier. So the point to draw from this is that 10 years ago, this chart would have looked a lot different. 10 years ago, this probably would have been Java, C#, ASP, Visual Basic, Tier 1, and a ton of stuff in Tier 2. It's not. The reality is that language fragmentation is here. Language fragmentation is accelerating. And what does that mean? It means that when you think about shadow IT, when you think about sort of developers within your organizations, which are doing things that are not sanctioned, they're doing it with the languages that they want to. They're doing it with the languages that they choose. So standards. What is the state of standards, and what do developers have to do with this? So the preamble to the next chart is that many of you may sort of be aware of this. Many of you may even have participated in this in some format. For many years, particularly in the last decade, some of the largest, biggest, best resourced, and most powerful technology companies in the world attempted to impose their will on the web, essentially the web as it is. Right? They attempted to impose top-down a set of standards. So collectively, these standards are referred to by the WS sort of asterisk nomenclature. And some of these standards were comically over-designed and overdeveloped. Right? So there are two standards, WS reliable messaging, WS-reliable messaging. They're two different standards, literally. And this is what developers had to contend with. They had to contend with vendors saying, this is how things are going to work. These are the standards that you will use. This is essentially how the web is going to work. The web's going to look very much like an internal network that we built and designed. So what happened? Yeah, that didn't happen. Ultimately, developers looked at this, ran away screaming, and this is charts of the adoption rate, and the sort of the API, the distribution of standards within APIs as measured by the programmable web. And effectively, the war is over, and REST destroyed the WS star stack. And it destroyed it because developers rejected it. Because all of the employees, all the developers, freelance, working at your organizations, didn't want to use it, and didn't. And they routed around it. So this is, again, we look at language fragmentation. We look at the state of standards. You have developers making choices. You have developers who are empowered, even in the face of tremendously well-resourced opposition, even in the face of a determined effort by some of the biggest, most powerful companies in the world. And it just got rejected. So then software adoption, this is probably not going to be a surprise to you. Many of you actually probably seen this chart before. So this is Netcraft. Netcraft surveys, essentially usage of web servers, among other things. And you can see dating back well into the 90s, Apache's been the sort of most popular, by a pretty fair margin most years, web serving usage. And why is this significant? Well, it's significant because Microsoft, I'm trying to think of a more diplomatic way to say monopoly, but Microsoft obviously has had a very, very significant market share from a server perspective. Microsoft also has embedded in its server product, almost as long as it's been around, a web server of its own, Internet Information Server, IIS. And they've invested real dollars over the years to try to make this sort of a default product. And it's on here. It's used, certainly. It's a very capable product. It's never come close, really, to denting the share of the developer's choice, Apache. IBM, separately, IBM used to have its own HTTP server that they shipped and they attempted to try and sell. And eventually IBM looked at this and said, this is a waste of time. We're not going to sell this product against Apache. So the hell with it. We're just going to adopt Apache and start shipping that in our product. So the point here is, again, developers are advantaging open source software because it's easier for them to get, it's easier for them to work with, it's easier for them to use. And this is the impact. This is the results. So we keep seeing over and over and over again demonstrations and standards, software usage and so on, of developer preferences. And at the end of the day, what happens? The developer preferences tend to win out, more often than not. So, okay, fine. we can accept for the sake of argument that shadow IT is here to stay. Developers are sort of empowered. What do I do? Right? This is the question facing, well, most organizations today of any size. Okay, fine. I accept your sort of data points. Keep going. What's the plan? Well, this is going to sound counterintuitive. We suggested they treat it like a baby treats bacteria, right? And initially, when people, when we make this argument, people freak out. They're like, wait, I thought you said that, shadow IT could be a good thing and speed up organizations and so on. Like, why would I treat it like bacteria? Why do I treat it like something that affects and kills people and so on? And at the end of the day, you have to remember that biologically speaking, bacteria isn't good or bad, right? Intrinsically. So yes, there are bacteria, that cause plagues and can kill us. But on the flip side, there are bacteria that, basically, it helps keep the digestive process in the human body working, right? In some cases, it can help prevent certain kinds of cancers. We use bacteria to clean up oil spills. So bacteria can be good or bad. And there was a great article that actually came out in the last couple of weeks in Nature. So you can read this, but as any new parent knows, infants are notoriously susceptible to bacterial infections. A study now suggests the body engineers this vulnerability deliberately, allowing beneficial microbes to colonize the baby's gut, skin, mouth, and lungs. So the idea here is that evolution has engineered in the human body a lowering of the defenses to let the bacteria in, to let, recognizing that bacteria are necessary to our survival, necessary to our digestive processes, among other things. And they allow the bacteria to come in. They allow the bacteria to colonize the body. And this, again, is very much what we recommend. In terms of talking to organizations about shadow IT, understand that shadow IT is neither intrinsically good nor intrinsically bad. It can be good if you don't try to fight it. Which brings us to, all right, if I accept that further, if I accept that shadow IT is here to stay, and if I accept that, okay, maybe that's sort of a useful analogy, useful strategy, how do I do that specifically? Well, the first lesson comes from King Canute. Anybody know this story? Anybody heard this? All right. If you've ever heard the phrase, don't fight the tide, this is where this comes from. So King Canute set his throne by the seashore and commanded the tide to halt and not wet his feet and robes. Yet, continuing to rise up as usual, the tide dashed over his feet and legs without respect to royal person. So here's the point. Everything that we've talked about that is now empowering developers, empowering the individuals within your organization, it's not going away. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. You cannot fight this tide. So our suggestion is don't try. And you see this sort of over and over and over again within organizations where it's, to go back to the bacteria example, they try to use antibiotics all over the place to try to wipe out the sort of bacteria that is shadow IT, and they just pop up somewhere else. So the question that we ask is, all right, given the effort level, given everything that that you need to do, all of the attention that you need to invest to try to hold that back, to try to stop it, A, it's probably not going to work. And B, what are you getting from that? What do you gain? Because, step two is take your foot off the brake, right? IT, unfortunately, and there are multiple surveys that confirm this, IT, for better or for worse, has become a pejorative, for most organizations. And that's no detriment to the IT people in the room because, look, you have a job to do, and, most of the organizations, at least that I've worked with, try hard, they do a good job. But IT in most organizations has become the brake, has become the, no, we can't do that, or yes, we can do that, but it's going to take 6 months or 8 months or 10 months or 12 months. And our suggestion is don't do that. I had a conversation with a city government yesterday. And he very much followed the process that I outlined earlier where they had an organization that was trying to do some updates. They had the vendors come in. He went out and built a system. He built a system that basically monitors their water usage. He built it all himself using off-the-shelf components, cloud gear, et cetera. And he did it before the decision-making process had even finished. So again, when you think about this organizationally, what would happen to your organization if you just took your foot off the brake and said, okay, if you think you can do this quickly, if you think you have a faster way to do it, great. Because one of the nice things here, given the pieces that we talked about, shadow IT is never going to come to you and say, all right, I can get this done faster, but I need $5 million. Right? They're going to come to you and say, I can get this done faster, and by the way, software costs nothing or is much more affordable than the alternatives. I can do it on hardware that's going to cost you a fraction of what it would otherwise. And guess what? I've trained myself, so I know what I'm doing. Right? Why wouldn't you take that risk? If your financial risk is lower and the upside is much, much higher in terms of the speed of delivery, the velocity at which you can operate, that seems like a pretty acceptable risk in most cases. And then lastly, Learnujitsu. So, the interesting thing is that we talk to organizations, even organizations that are sort of progressive and say, all right, I'm sort of willing to not try to fight the tide. I'm willing to, take my foot off the brake and let them go. But, I still have concerns. I have concerns about management. I have concerns about compliance. I have concerns, this, that, and the other thing. And this is where sort of, from our standpoint, the jiu-jitsu comes in, right? Which is, this is from Wikipedia. So it's essentially the art of manipulating an opponent's force against himself rather than confronting it with one's own force. Well, what does that mean in this context? Well, rather than trying to fight the tide, rather than trying to directly oppose shadow IT, help get them where they're going, but manage that process as you do so, right? So what we've seen, for example, organizations do very effectively is say, all right, if you want to use Amazon, that's fine. But you need to bill it essentially through us. So there's a little bit of give and take, right? You can say, fine, you want to use this tool, it's faster, maybe it's more efficient, that's great, but we're going to bill it for you, we're going to make your life easier because you don't need to expense it on your card, but now we gain visibility. So what you're doing is basically taking their momentum and using it effectively in your favor, right? You basically co-opt that process. So as you move forward, as you think about it, our suggestion in all of this is to think about the evidence in front of you. Think about the free software, the low-cost hardware, all of the resources that are available, and more importantly, the results that can be delivered much more efficiently, much more cost-effectively moving forward if you just get out of the way. And if you just let your organizations operate as they could operate if you weren't hitting the brakes all the time. And with that, I'm complete. And I think we have time for 2 questions, if anybody has them. Any questions?
Sure.
Shoot.
Okay, I'm a CIO. I run a corporation. I have a software development group. But the fact is, with a relatively small group, they still come up with 3 completely different solutions for every problem as I let them have their own enthusiasms, their own choices. So how do I get these guys to actually just, I don't know, get on the same wavelength with one another at some level so that they don't just produce chaos?
Sure. So for those of you who missed the first part of the question, essentially it's, hey, I have 3 different developers, 3 different teams that are effectively stepping on each other's toes. Is that fair to say? So part of that, honestly, is it's going to depend on the level of effort, right? Because in many cases, a parallel development track actually may not be a bad thing. Because in other words, generally speaking, if you have 3 projects that are the same, you're going to have 3 chances to get it right. Now the question becomes, look, if these are 3 6-month projects, that's a huge problem. But one of the things that we encourage people to really think about is that with tools like Git and GitHub and so on, when you're decentralizing the process of development, it allows you to develop sort of serially, in parallel rather than serially. So in other words, you can develop in multiple different places quickly, and at the end of the day, it's almost a Darwinian process. Your projects which are developed more quickly, they have to fight and compete, and if you're outcompeted, you don't survive. But again, like I said, a lot of it depends on sort of the length. If you're talking 6-month projects, then I'd want to sit down and have a conversation with your developers about their collaboration strategy and get them to look into tools like GitHub because the likelihood is strong at some point that they're reinventing the wheel, and that's a waste of time. One other question? Shoot.
Hi. in your graph about the programming languages, you didn't mention Perl, or don't you consider Perl as a programming language?
Perl is in there, I believe. We can go back and look. Perl is. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure Perl should be in. Yeah. So it's up in tier 1. And Perl is one of those languages that, frankly, it's, I described and articulated the, the reality for the marketplace, 10 years ago as being primarily Java and .NET. The interesting thing is that that was the reality that most people thought. Again, going back to the Venn diagram, that was actually never true, right? Huge swaths of the web, in particular, were run by Perl. So that, this graph never would have been quite as sort of simple, as, I think a lot of people, as I said, would like to believe. But, the interesting thing with Perl, though, is that moving forward, it's having a tougher and tougher time competing against languages. And frankly, all languages are. I talk to Java audiences, they don't like to hear this. But Java will never be more popular, than it was. It has peaked, it's in decline, and Java audiences hate to hear that. But it has nothing to do with Java. Java is actually still growing, and it's a very robust, healthy language. It's just that it faces a lot more competition. It's much easier to dominate a contest with 3 or 4 players than it is to dominate a contest, with, whatever we have, 12 to 14, in tier 1. So that's the sort of reality for all of the modern runtimes, is that there's a lot more competition. There's a lot more sort of use the best tool for the job, which is good in the sense that it gives different languages opportunities, but it's bad in the sense that the absolute share for any one of these properties is unlikely to ever be what it was before. With that, I think we're done. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.